Awakening of Twin Blades released in English on February 22nd, 2013, more than a year after its original release in Japan, where it massively impacted the Japanese format. An impact so massive that it reverberated into the English release, allegedly causing the mess that was the English release schedule. Today, I tease you no longer. We'll finally go over Majesty Lord Blaster and Gigantic Overlord, The End. The release of Awakening of Twin Blades marked the end of the first season of the anime, with the three main characters of that finale featured on the box art, Kai, Aichi, and Ren. Their respective final bosses of the season release this set, with Gigantic Overlord, The End, also known as DOTE for short, Majesty Lord Blaster, known as MLB for short, and Phantom Blaster Overlord. You would think these three would be the big three instead. While Phantom Blaster Overlord, known as PBO for short, was up there with these competitively, Tsukuyomi took its place as the Big Three. This is mainly due to the Big Three being a term that addresses the Japanese format, more than the English format. Tsukuyomi actually wasn't as popular in English as she was in Japan, perhaps due to her difficulty of use, her art not being some dragon with weapons, or just the altered release schedule. So for some English players, the phrase Big Three might actually only refer to MLB, DOTE, and PBO. Kai, Aichi, and Ren and their three units were so iconic that this same theme was reused for the fifth booster in the standard format, Triumphant Return of the Brave Heroes, which saw the release of MLB, DOTE, and PBO as encounters. These characters and units even made it into the recent Shadowverse Evolve Cardfight Vanguard collab, 12 years after their release. This set included a total of 80 cards, with 2 extra cards being added in to the English release. These additional cards were promos previously released in the Japanese format. These cards were Conjurer of Mithril for Warrior Paladin, a Devil Summoner clone, and Demonic Mage Maharaga for Kagero. This set included support for a total of 10 clans. The clans for the Big Three barely got any cards, with Warrior Paladin getting 9, Kagero with 5, and OTT with 4. But this set is more well known for the release of 2 of the Big Three, MLB in Warrior Paladin and DOTE for Kagero, who were the chase cards for this set. The third of the Big Three is Goddess of the Full Moon Tsukuyomi in OTT, who we've discussed at great lengths before, being released in an earlier set. The other clans in this set included Shadow Paladin with 8 cards, Nova Grappler, Dimension Police, Dark Irregulars, and Pale Moon, with all of them getting 4 cards each. And then finally, the last 2 were the brand new clans, Nectar and Murakumo, with 22 and 18 cards respectively. We can start with Nova Grappler and Oracle Think Tank, who both received trial decks on January 25th, 2013, a month before this set was released. Trial Deck 3, Golden Mechanical Soldier, and Trial Deck 4, Maiden Princess of the Cherry Blossoms. These were released between sets 2 and 3 in Japan. These trial decks don't actually include much worth talking about, if I'm being honest, containing mostly reprints of commons and rares from their first wave of support, or a few cyclers the clans just hadn't received yet. The most notable cards were the cover cards, Gold Rutail for Nova Grappler and Goddess of Flower Divination Sakya from OTT. Gold Rutail was like a mini version of Mr. Invincible, who was actually reprinted in this deck, as it could unflip and restand one of your rear cards. Sakya could give power if you had a lot of cards in hand, similar to CEO Amaterasu, who was not reprinted in this deck actually. She could also return all your rear cards to your hand, which is not something the clan was really known for, and I don't believe we'll see again in this clan. As for their support in this booster set, there was, again, not really a lot to talk about. Nova Grappler received the Street Bouncer, which allowed Peace Reliant decks like the Stern Blaukluger to be a bit more consistent. OTT received the Battle Sister Ginger, a new critical trigger for the clan. There was also the Evil Eye Princess Urale, a grade 3 that was featured prominently in the anime. She retained her super cool skill of binding one of your opponent's cards from their hand, restricting their guarding options. There was also the not at all cool Top Gun, a grade 3 for Nova Grappler that also showed up in the anime prominently for some reason. Dimension Police also received 4 cards that were not massive for the clan. They received a new stand trigger and the super dimensional robo Die Lady, who helped Daisha and Enigma reach their much needed power thresholds. This card also recently got printed in the standard format as an encounter. Next up is Shadow Paladin, who received 12 cards. One of these was a new critical trigger, allowing the clan to finally play the coveted 8 crit 4 draw 4 heal trigger lineup. They also finally got a Mega Blast unit which could retire all of your opponent's rear guards. They received 3 Cyclers, Moonlight Witch Baja, a clone of Maiden of Libra, Nightmare Painter, a card who shares its effect with several cards in the same set, and finally, Knight of Nullify Masquerade. Masquerade could gain 3k power, but only when it attacked while you had a specific Vanguard. This allowed the unit to attack a grade 3 while not being boosted. You'll see a lot of cards with these effects in the coming future, and you'll also practically see one for every single archetype that comes out in the game's history, as the game leans more towards releasing archetypes. OTT also received a unit like this in this set, and even though it doesn't mention a specific archetype, its requirement made it clear that it was designed more towards use in Tsukiyumi. Cards like these could even attack into MLB, who could actually have 12k power into your opponent's turn. They, however, could not attack into Vanguards that were cross rides, which is a new mechanic introduced in this set. DOTE, who we mentioned earlier, and the new Phantom Blaster Overlord had access to this new mechanic. However, to call it a game mechanic was a bit generous. Cross rides intended for you to ride a specific grade 3 over another specific grade 3, hence the name. The new grade 3 you rode would then gain an additional 2k power during both players' turns, making most of them 13k. And that's really all there was to this mechanic for now. Don't be fooled, this was still very powerful and game-changing, however, as it required your opponent to always call out a booster to even attempt to deal a damage. This includes Vanguards, as all non-crossed ride grade 3 Vanguards were either 10 or 11k without an effect to give them power. We're still in the early stages of the game where every single card matters immensely, so forcing your opponent to call out a grade 1 that they could have kept in hand for shield was huge. This is also why cards like Palmedes and Dual Arc's Archdragon were great, as they could hit the 13k threshold on their own. Cross rides were also an expensive mechanic to introduce to the game, as it often required you to play a previously released triple rare at max copies, and also a newly released triple rare at max copies. Before, your grade 3 slots could be 4 copies of your main Vanguard, probably a triple rare, and some solid rares or commons. But with Persona Blast being used on these cross rides as well, your grade 3 lineup is just now 8 triple rares. You could actually get away with playing fewer copies of either, however, as you could even cheat into cross ride and not wait to ride. This was done with cards like the previously mentioned Nightmare Painter. Nightmare Painter allowed you to put a card from your hand into Soul. While this had no obvious benefit on its own, it did activate PBO's cross ride. PBO gained 2k power continuously if you had PBD in your Soul. You could also pay Counterblast 3 and Persona Blast to have PBO gain 10k power and additional critical. PBO was solid, but not more powerful than DOTE. You mainly beat down your opponent with your cross ride numbers and good Shadow Paladin cards, and then use its crit and power gaining effect to close out the game. Here's what an updated Shadow Paladin list might have looked like. We make use of the new critical trigger to make the deck more lethal, and use combo lines of Matcha to call Nightmare Painter straight from the deck to tuck in your PBD and have your cross ride immediately be active. A card that a lot of players played a few copies of was the Apocalypse Bat, that could make really good numbers of 23k with PBL, similar to the Garmor Charge Goal center line we've discussed in the past. Here's another list that actually used the Wingo Brave from Warrior Paladin, as it could search out any card with Blaster in its name if it boosted a card with Blaster in its name. This includes Phantom Blaster Dragon, Phantom Blaster Overlord, Blaster Dark, and even Blaster Javelin. Speaking of Wingo Brave, let's go over one of the big 3, Majesty Lord Blaster. MLB was one of the cards Warrior Paladin received this set, but actually required you to use Blaster Dark from Shadow Paladin in your deck. MLB had an effect that allowed you to put both Blaster Blade and Blaster Dark from the field into your Soul. in order to gain 10k power. This would raise its power to 20k. However, as I alluded to earlier, MLB could gain an additional 2k power on top of that. This was due to its other continuous effect that would give it 2k power if you had Blaster Dark and Blaster Blade in your soul. On top of that, this effect also gave you an additional crit on your Vanguard. This was part of what made MLB so powerful. MLB was a menace offensively, able to maintain constant crit pressure from its Vanguard swing. It was the only unit at this time to gain an additional critical for essentially the rest of the game, with no upkeep like Dayusha or Lox had, or without having to pay a Mega Blast cost. This effect also worked on defense, similar to Cross Rides, forcing your opponent to call out boosters for even the Vanguard swing if they couldn't match its 12k attack on their turn. In addition, being in Royal Paladin gave the deck access to at least 12 critical triggers that they could play in their deck, making each attack a potential 3 to 4 damaging one in a single swing. If you had one of each blaster on board, that was a 22k attack coming at your opponent that could deal 2 damage, not accounting for a booster or drive checks yet. All for almost no cost. MLB was very consistent also, thanks to their starter, the aforementioned Wingull Brave. Along with being a forerunner, Wingull could directly search out any blaster from your deck, including the Majesty Lord Blaster himself. Here's what a list for MLB looked like. You could get away with playing even less copies of MLB, as Wingull Brave could search it out for you, and you could even ditch the draws to play even more crits. The other noteworthy cards in this list are cards from this set: Knight of Loyalty, Belvedere, who had the same effect as the Knight of Nullify, Masquerade, we just discussed, and the Knight of Friendship, K. K has an effect that we'll also see copy and pasted on every archetype going further. A grade 1 that gained 3k power on attack if your Vanguard was part of a specific archetype or name. After MLB, we can finally go over the last member of the big three, Gigantic Overlord, the End. Gigantic Overlord, the End was from Kagero, and was the evolved form of Gigantic Overlord, one of many forms to come. DOTE was potentially the strongest of the three, even though it ironically lost its debut match in the anime. DOTE was a cross-ride with the original Gigantic Overlord. Like its counterpart, DOTE could also restand on the Vanguard Circle. The main difference, aside from the cost, was that DOTE did not lose any drives when restanding. We've seen how powerful a restanding Vanguard was in the 2012 World Championship Series with Spectral Duke Dragon. Now imagine if Spectral Duke could keep its twin drive, not require limit break, and not have to retire any rear guards. Here's what a list for DOTE might have looked like. While DOTE could be very powerful, it did come with its weaknesses. There was no way to cheat your cross ride, meaning you needed to ride into Gigantic Overlord first, making the deck a turn slower than PBO or MLB for its maximum output. In addition, if you decided to forgo the cross ride, you needed extra copies of DOTE in hand, as you needed to Persona Blast to restand. The main strength of the deck came from restanding as quickly as possible and riding that tempo to snowball through your opponent. You don't really have the space to play cards like the Dual Axe Arch Dragon, so your main attacker is the Burning Horn Dragon, which is similar to the Belvedere and Masquerade, whose collective effect we can just call 12k attackers going further. A lot of players opted to play the Gatling Claw Dragon in DOTE, not just to draw into your pieces, but also to snipe Wingull Brave if they managed to get the counterblast in time. It could also snipe Gold Paladin's Crypt as well. Here's another DOTE list that was submitted to me by someone who was playing at this time, with the main difference being the use of the Berserk Dragon. With that, we've finally been introduced to all of the big three. These were the top 3 decks that dominated the Japanese format. There's apparently a Japanese player who famously said at the time, there are 2 types of Vanguard tournament participants. You either play big 3 or you just don't want to win. And this summed up the year after Twin Blades released in Japan. You can probably see why now. MLB being able to have constant crit pressure and consistency with little cost or counterplay. DOTE able to do 4 drives in a single turn while having cross-ride numbers. And Tsukiyumi able to strategically check triggers when they needed to and shoot you with Tom's Guard Restrict. However, you also need to remember that upon release in Japan, there was no Gold Paladin yet, like there was for the English format. On top of this, the strongest clans before the Limit Breaker were already Royal Paladin, Kagero, and to an extent OTT. This set just elevated Royals and Kagero even further ahead of any other clan for many sets after the release of Twin Blades. The Limit Break era was a bit of a soft reset, with Limit Break decks attempting to balance and slow down the game, locking down powerful effects to later stages of the game. They even locked away MLB and DOTE from being used in the anime at the time, but not all these effects were that powerful, and most of the decks did nothing without hitting Limit Break first. For example, let's take the poster boy of Limit Break, Blonde Ezo. Without Limit Break, Ezo could only skip ride into grade 3, something Kagero could do since set 1, and gained 1k power for each gold paladin rearguard, something Royal Paladin could do since set 1 also. After Limit Break, Ezo could counterblast 2, call a gold paladin from the top card of your deck, and gain power. This required you to be at 4 damage, spend 2 counterblasts, just to have a Vanguard that could maybe reach 22k or more on its own. MLB could do that at 0 damage, with no counterblast used, and have a crit on the Vanguard on its first grade 3 turn as well. The strongest Limit Break card that we've spent so much time talking about, Spectral Duke Dragon, is the only one that could really compare to the big 3, but it also had the same core weaknesses as the other Limit Break decks, needing that damage threshold that your opponent could just damage deny you with, or that you could even heal out of and lose all of your effects. Heck, MLB could easily keep Limit Break decks at 3 damage and threaten lethal with the Vanguard having a crit. Many players were forced to play 4 PGs at this stage, as you needed them to guard MLB or PBO's crits, or to stop DOTE from restanding. This would eventually trickle into the English format, with Royal and Kagero PGs being upwards to $60 and $70 a copy. This made any deck that came out after Twin Blades weaker than the big 3 in Japan, giving players no reason to play them competitively, or buy any product that didn't support the big 3. Kagero and Royal Paladin received no relevant support during this time. So once you got your cards from set 3, you had no reason to buy any further product in the entire Limit Break era. In Japan, out of the 45 tournaments between September 29th, 2011 and January 14th, 2012, Royals, Kagero, and OTT topped a total of 73, 43, and 26 times respectively, 71% of the total available tops. After the release of Twin Blades, from January 14th, 2012 to January 1st, 2013, there were 62 tournaments, of which the big 3 specifically continued to top 58, 79, and 26 times respectively, a total of 54% for these 3 specific decks alone. I mentioned the date January 1st, 2013 specifically because that is the date that the big 3 finally got hit with a restriction in Japan. From this date forward, you could only use a maximum of 2 copies of any combination of the following cards in a deck in the Japanese format: King of Knights Alfred, Majesty Lord Blaster, and Wingle Brave in Royal Paladin, Gigantic Overlord The End and Lizard Soldier Conro for Kagero, and Silent Tom, Godhawk Ichibiyoshi, and Goddess of the Full Moon Tsukiyumi for OTT. What this meant is that if you wanted to continue playing DOTE, for example, your choices were you could only have 1 copy of Lizard Soldier Conro and 1 copy of DOTE, or up to 2 copies of DOTE and 0 copies of Conro, or up to 2 copies of Conro and 0 copies of DOTE in your deck in order for it to be considered legal for play. This effectively killed DOTE and Tsukuyomi for the most part, as you could only use DOTE's effect a single time, and you could only use a single copy of the grade 3 of your ride chain and 1 copy of your game ender in OTT. The hit to Tsukiyumi was so massive that there was even a petition created to undo the change to her. This should finally explain why the English release schedule was so drastically altered, as Bushiroad was attempting to prevent a similar situation and wanted the Limit Break decks to have a fighting chance. Bushiroad was not going to allow a 3-deck format again for the global market, one that invalidates any product that they wanted to push out for nearly a year. While it was never officially stated, it's pretty clear that this set and the big 3 are what caused the change in the English release schedule. Of course, this created a power vacuum that was filled by Gold Paladin and Spectral Duke Dragon alone in the English format. That said, what about the English format? Now that these problematic. Cards have arrived. When will the English restriction lists come? There was a lot of confusion as the Japanese restriction list was announced around the time of the English release of Twin Blades. But in reality, Bushiroad never implemented the same restriction for the big three in the English format. The reason for not implementing the same restriction was that delaying the release of these decks ended up rounding out the format. That power vacuum that Gold Paladin took advantage of, well, that was now sealed thanks to MLB and DOTE being able to compete with Spectral Duke. This alone opened the format from one S tier deck to 3 powerful decks, while other decks like PBO, Tsukiyomi, and Narukami were also allowed to compete. We'd also get yet another top deck in the upcoming set, Blue Storm Armada, with the release of Maelstrom and subsequent upgrades for all Limit Break decks in the set after that, Clash of Knights and Dragons, another end of season set. This restriction list is what is the start of what we know today as choice restrictions in Vanguard. But let's finally continue going over the cards in this set. Dark Irregulars and Pale Moon only received 4 cards each, a new Draw and Stand Trigger respectively, a Grade 1 and Grade 2 Cycler, and a new triple rare Grade 3 Vanguard. King of Diptera Beelzebub was a 10k Vanguard that became 11k on both turns if you had enough cards in your soul, and also gave power to 2 other Dark Irregulars on attack. Mistress Hurricane shared the same effect of becoming an 11k Vanguard, but rather than giving power like Beelzebub, could call out a Pale Moon card from your soul on ride. These new Grade 3s were not very powerful on their own and were often backup rides for Ramon and Lukier. Murakumo is one of the brand new clans introduced in this set. This clan is often confused with Nubatama and has a very close relationship to that clan, but we'll discuss that more in the far future. Like Nubatama, Murakumo is themed around ninjas, with 17 out of the 18 cards introduced in this set, including the word stealth in their name. The only one that didn't was the Grade 3 triple rare, Covert Demonic Dragon Mandala Lord. Granted, Covert is kind of another way to say stealth, but anyways, Mandala Lord was an 11k Vanguard with a unique effect to Counterblast 1 and Persona Blast to reduce the power of an opponent's attacking unit. I believe this is the first card that lets you Counterblast or interact with your opponent's units outside of your turn. This would effectively give your extra copies of Mandala Lord in hand 10k shield value, the same as your triggers. Other cards Murakumo received were one of each trigger, a PG, 10k and 8k Grade 2 and Grade 1 vanillas, a Mega Blast unit with the same exact effect as Mr. Invincible, and a countercharger in Stealth Beast White Mane. Murakumo had a lot of cards with unique effects as well, with the general gimmick for the clan revolving around getting additional copies of the same name card from deck to field. The Stealth Beast, Million Rats, Midnight Crow, and Void Jelga could all do this on place, but would then return those copies back to the deck at the end of the turn. This seemed to mimic a ninja's fabled abilities to create disguises and illusions, and then magically disappear. Finally, there's the Stealth Dragons, Cursed Breath, and Turbulent Edge, who gave Mandala Lord consistency, able to search for copies of Mandala Lord from the top 5 cards of your deck. Murakumo had a solid first wave and had some similarities to Nova Grappler, copying the deck's Mega Blast unit and low attack units to search for Persona Blast cards. It will, however, have a rather strange history going further. For now, this is what a Murakumo list might have looked like. While interesting, the deck had many low-powered rear guards and no way to really gain power or win games outside of the Mega Blast restand. Nectar was the last new clan introduced in this set. Nectar received the most cards in this set, with 22 cards. However, it was possibly the least sought out of all the cards in the set. Players would often complain about pulling Nectar cards instead of MLB or DOTE, and would even trade into higher playsets of the clan for a single copy of MLB. Overall, the clan was supported similarly to Murakumo, with one of each trigger, a PG, 10 and 8k Grade 2 and Grade 1 vanillas, several cyclers, clan unique cards of each grade with similar effects, but strangely, no Mega Blast unit. Nectar seemed to be themed around druids and sylvan creatures, or inhabitants of a wood or forest. The true gimmick or mechanic explored by the clan isn't revealed in this wave just yet. For now, we have the evolving Forest Knights of Shield Seed Squire, Blade Seed Squire, Knight of Verdure, Gene, and Knight of Harvest, Gene. These were grade 0 through grade 3 cards that all share the same effect to shuffle themselves back into the deck, call out the card from this group with one grade higher than themselves from the deck, but rested when their attack hit. Knight of Harvest Gene, the grade 3, called 2 copies of the grade 2 instead. This effect was perhaps to mimic a tree growing from a seed into a giant plant, or a grade 3 in this case. The triple rare for the clan was Maiden of Trailing Rose. This was an 11k base Vanguard who could Counterblast 1 and Persona Blast after its attack hit a Vanguard to search out for any 2 Neo Nectar cards from the top 5 of your deck and call them to the field. This is an extremely powerful effect, and one the clan makes use of to this very day, but in a much stronger card. However, currently, the options to call were not super great. Here's a list I received from a player that was playing at this time. Neo Nectar had a strong Vanguard effect with Trailing Rose, and even with no good rear guards to make use of it, it was still very solid. The deck could play good and fair Vanguard, and managed to get a few official tournament tops in Japan. Also, the fan favorite, Hey Yo Pineapple, was introduced in this set. Awakening of Twin Blades is a monumental set in the game's history, both for the Japanese and for the English formats. MLB and DOTE will continue to see play for a long time to come, especially with DOTE being one of the era and even the game's most famous cards. Vanguard as a whole is doing pretty good at this time, off the back of a somewhat successful first championship series, and now with many strong decks for English players to pick up. During this time, the game continued to grow and thrive, but also grew as an alternative for players of other games, like Konami's Yu-Gi-Oh!, who saw the game as a safe haven from the Insector, Wind-Up, and soon to be Dragon Ruler mess that they were seeing in their own game. While the messy English release schedule may have pushed some players away, those days are finally behind us. We now have all the sets numbered between 1 through 7 released in the English format. Next time, we take a look at Set 8, Blue Storm Armada, and the arrival of Aqua Force.